My name is Helen Freris. I'm the Health Services Program Manager at Women with Disabilities Victoria. I'm coming to you from Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, land that has never been ceded. And I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Helen. So my name is Swazik Bohan. My pronouns are she, her, and I am coming to you from Wurundjeri country. And I am the program manager for the Gender and Disability Workforce Development Program at WDV, Women with Disabilities Victoria. And I might hand over to Lena and Taswa, who will be facilitating breakout rooms later today.
Thanks, Swazik. My name is Lena Molnar. I'm the Workforce Capacity Building Officer at Women with Disabilities Victoria. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm meeting with you all today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I look forward to having a chat with some of you during the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Lena. Hi, everyone. My name is Tathra Street, and I am the Gender and Disability Training Coordinator as part of the Workforce Development Program at Women with Disabilities Victoria. I'm also on Wurundjeri country, and yeah, looking forward to seeing some of you in the breakout rooms. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we'll start off with just a presentation that Swazik and I are going to share about changing the landscape, which, as Zoe said at the start of the forum, it's the evidence base for the prevention of violence against women with disabilities, and we're looking forward to sharing it with you now.
Thank you, Helen. So before we start, we just would like to say a couple of words about WDV, Women with Disabilities Victoria, for those of you who are not familiar with our organization. So as our name says, we are the peak organization for women with disabilities in Victoria. And we are a not-for-profit organization run by and for women with disabilities. Today, about 80% of our staff identifies as a woman with a disability. We have a number of goals, but the three main activities we are doing are to empower women. We engage and empower women with disabilities to lead and influence their communities. We also aim to influence services. We educate and build the capacity of service systems and organizations to be accessible to women with disabilities. And we also influence policy. We influence government and the community to recognize and remove barriers to full participation by women with disabilities. If you'd like to know more about our organization and our work, you can visit our website at wdv.org.au.
Thank you, Swazik. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about changing the landscape, but just before I do, as Zoe reminded us this morning, the issue of violence against women is very pertinent, and it affects not only people with whom we work, but it may well affect us or people that we know. So I'd encourage you, if there are other people in the place where you are at the moment, you might want to wear headphones so that the content of what we're discussing is only audible to you. So what is changing the landscape? It's a new resource. It's national, and it's a resource to prevent violence against women and girls with disabilities. It complements and also expands on the evidence and guidance in another document, which many people I'm sure are familiar with, called Changing the Story. And it builds and deepens really the understanding of violence against women. And it really just places a disability lens across the Change the Story framework. And it goes into quite a lot of detail about the dynamics of violence against women with disabilities that may not have been explained very much before. It talks about the drivers of violence against women with disabilities and also what we can do to prevent it. So essential actions that can be used. And the resource, very importantly, is a partnership between WDV and Our Watch in its production. So we're looking forward to speaking to you more about the drivers, the essential actions, and the principles on which the work is based. And of course, the resource is aimed really at everyone who works in any way with the prevention of violence against women. So it could be people working in policy, anyone working with organisations, strategies of organisations, people working in disability, and more broadly in gender equality. So we're really excited to have been part of this partnership and to be able to share the resource with you. The other aspect of change the landscape rather, which is really important alongside change the story, is the very strong emphasis which Swazik's going to talk about around primary prevention. So I'll hand over to Swazik now.
Thank you, Helen. So it's true that changing the landscape is really a primary prevention framework. So what is primary prevention? Usually we would describe it as an upstream approach, because primary prevention really means that we want to prevent violence from happening in the first place. We want to do that because if we wait longer, violence is going to have a damaging impact on women with disabilities. And it means that as organizations, we are going to have to engage in other forms of intervention, mostly early intervention, response, and also recovery. So primary prevention is really about stopping violence before it starts. And we do that by addressing what we call the drivers, which are the causes of violence. So it is what Change the Story is saying. And what Changing the Landscape is doing is that the framework adds a disability lens to primary prevention. And it really emphasizes the ways more people with disabilities can access resources, can be included, and can get involved in the work we do to end violence before it starts. And I will hand over to Helen to talk a little bit more about changing the landscape.
Thank you. Thanks, Swazik. A concept that you will read a lot about if you access Changing the Landscape is ableism. So we'll talk a bit about that now because it's a term that is really important when we think about the prevention of violence against women with disabilities. So ableism has a lot in common with the other isms that we often speak about in gender equality work, so sexism, racism, etc. So ableism is really a belief system and it's beliefs, processes and practices that privilege people without disabilities and disadvantage and exclude people with disabilities. So if the idea is that people without disabilities are privileged in the system of ableism and people with disabilities are disadvantaged by it. And there are some particular models, I guess, that have been used around disability, which we'll also talk about. But in terms of ableism, I guess the beliefs to think about are those which are dominant ideas in society, expectations about typical people and who they are, what typical people do, and ideas about people's bodies and minds. So society applies these standards all the time to determine who is worthy or normal or able, and discriminates against and disadvantages people who fail to meet these standards, which are arbitrary, and they have shifted in society across time. So these beliefs and practices, processes lead to people with disabilities being denied their fundamental human rights and being devalued in society in the way that society operates. And they unfortunately also create the type of social context which gives rise to and supports violence against people with disabilities and women with disabilities. And, you know, ableism in Australia is found everywhere across legal systems and frameworks. It's in the way that policy is developed and policies that we have governing our lives, planning about people with disabilities and about everyone generally, including where people live, how decisions about people's lives are made, and how we can access public spaces, if we can access public spaces. These are influenced by ableism. So a few models to think about in conceptualising disability where we see ableism sitting in a couple of them. So if we think about firstly the medical model, which is quite common still, and this model promotes special laws, policies, practices, segregation, paternalistic processes. You know, it's about fixing the disability. So the disability is someone's individual problem, and the medical model will fix it or put things in place to fix individual people. The charity model is an extension of that, where it creates particular ways of dealing with individual disability as, you know, something to be either dealt with if it can't be fixed. And the responsibility is largely on the people with the disability to find a way into the system as it is, with some, you know, supports and modifications along the way. There are some other models which challenge ableism a lot more specifically, and I'll hand over to Swazik to describe.
Thank you, Helen. So changing the landscape really emphasizes what we call the social model of disability. So this model is embedded in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's quite an important convention because today we estimate that 20% of the population identifies as having a disability in the world. And disability can cover many aspects. It can be a physical disability, a cognitive disability, a sensory disability, a psychosocial disability. So we have many different types of disabilities. So basically what the social model of disability says is that disability exists as a result of the interaction between a person's impairment and barriers related to attitudes, environments, communications, and institutions. Helen already mentioned some of those barriers, but let's provide a couple of additional examples. Attitudes refer to all the negative stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination we are going to have about people with disabilities. For example, it could be assuming that people with disabilities can't do certain things. Environmental barriers are going to refer mostly to inaccessible physical environments. For example, let's think of a building that doesn't have a ramp. It's not going to be accessible for someone who uses a wheelchair. We also have communications barrier. It could be, for example, let's imagine we have a video. If the video doesn't have subtitles, it's not going to be accessible for people who have a hearing disability. If the video doesn't have audio description, it's not going to be accessible for people who have a visual disability. And we also have many barriers in our institutions. It refers to all the laws, policies, and practices that discriminate against people with disabilities. For example, it could be a workplace that doesn't want to make the reasonable adjustment to recruit people with disabilities. And the social model really says that this is society's responsibility to recognize and remove these barriers. So compared to the previous models we had, the medical model, the charity model, responsibility is no longer individual. It is really society's responsibility. Changing the landscape also mentions what we call the human rights models. And this model is interesting because it takes the social model of disability even further. Basically, what the model says is that people with disabilities have the same human rights and fundamental freedoms as everyone else. And here, beyond society, it is governments who are responsible to ensure everyone enjoys the same human rights in society. So ableism and the social model of disability are really key components in changing the landscape, but it is a framework that mostly applies to women. So we also have a gender equality approach, and I will hand over to Helen to describe this approach.
Thank you, Swasik. So we've talked about disability and ableism and different models of disability that have characterised the way that we conceptualise disability over years. What Changing the Landscape invites us to do now is combine this thinking with thinking about gender, as we already do in the prevention of violence that we undertake. So if we're thinking about gender and its impacts, and how we think about disability, and we're thinking about equity for both, so gender, disability, equity. So according to Changing the Landscape, we take a gender equity approach, and it means that we understand how people are treated differently based on both their gender and their disability, and there might be other characteristics. So essentially, a man with a disability, evidence exists that a man with a disability will have a different experience to a woman or a non-binary person with a disability. And a trans person with a disability will have a different experience again to cisgender people. So we live in a world that's unequal, society which is unequal, and it treats women and gender diverse people as having less value and being less worthy of opportunities. And as we said before, the same goes for people with disabilities. So when these combine, they're the conditions that where violence can thrive. So if we're thinking about what we want to do and a society that we want, we're striving for a society that provides equal opportunity outcomes for people with all genders. And it requires that resources, structures are shifted so that inequality can be reversed. And so Changing the Landscape in its way that it's presented recognises and challenges the existing inequalities between men, women, gender diverse people with disabilities, and it recognises diversity and disadvantages created in a society that treats people differently. So a gender equality approach is, I guess, another key concept. So I'm going to continue on now to talk about the socio-ecological model of preventing violence against women with disabilities. So after we've analysed people's experiences as impacted by gender and disability and perhaps other intersectional factors as well, we're going to think about now how can we use a model in primary prevention which challenges inequality wherever we see it. And it's implemented throughout Changing the Landscape. So the socio-ecological model, which is familiar in Changing the Story, helps us to think about what we can do personally, in groups, businesses, institutions, socially for change to end violence against women with disabilities. So if we think about the highest level of the model, is the societal level. So social norms that we talked about before support rigid gender roles and stereotypes about people with disabilities, beliefs about people, who they are, who they should be, stereotyping, condoning, excusing, downplaying violence against women and girls with disabilities. So that exists at the societal level. The second level is the system and institutional level. So failure of systems, institutions and policies to promote economic, legal, societal autonomy for women and girls with disabilities, or to protect their human rights or to address violence against women when it happens. The third level is the organisational and community level. So we're getting closer to the centre as we go. Organisation and community norms, so the way that we do things in our organisations, in our distinct communities that we're part of, structures and practices that support or don't address gender inequality, ableism, stereotyping, discrimination, and violence. And the fourth and final level is, of course, the individual and relationship level, which we're all part of in our daily interactions with people. Individual adherence to, very rigid gender roles and identities that don't factor in any difference. Individual attachment to ableist beliefs about people, and very minimal support for gender or disability equality, social learning of violence against women and violence against people with disabilities, male dominance, controlling behaviours in relationships, and other behaviours which directly contribute to the experience of women and girls have of violence. So this model reminds us that no matter where we are, in whatever sphere we find ourselves, whether in our individual lives or in the lives of our organisations, groups, communities, institutions, societies, we can always challenge the drivers of violence against women with disabilities, which we'll hear about, and we can always do things to change those drivers and prevent violence. So I'm going to hand over to Swazik to tell us a bit about the context of violence against women and girls with disabilities.
Thank you, Helen. So we are going to share with you some statistics about experience of violence for women with disabilities. So the statistics can be quite confronting. So if you need to implement some self-care strategies, please don't hesitate to do that. We estimate today that over the lifetime, 65% of women with disabilities are going to experience some form of violence during the lifetime. For women without disabilities, the statistic is 45%. So if we unpack some types of violence, women with disabilities are twice as likely than women without disabilities to experience sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And what is even more confronting is that for some types of disabilities, especially for women who have a psychosocial disability, an intellectual disability, or complex communications needs, we know that the rates of violence are going to be even higher for those women. And I will hand over to you, Helen, to talk about the specific experiences of violence.
Thank you, Swazik. So as we know, and as evidence tells us, women with disabilities experience gender-based violence in contexts that are familiar to other women. So there's some uniformity, but also some differences in the experience of violence against women and girls with disabilities. So it's been found that women and girls with disability experience a broader range, experience violence with, or from rather, a broader range of perpetrators, so more perpetrators, intimate partners, ex-partners, family members, friends, also disability support carers, support workers, other service providers, staff in organisations, colleagues, peers and strangers. So a much broader range of perpetrators than is generally seen across the population of women. And women and girls experience violence in more settings. So as well as the home, private sphere, public settings, so online, on the street, public transport, workplaces, social, recreational settings. We've talked about homes and families already, but also institutional settings, segregated living settings, education and health settings, which are segregated, disability service settings like group homes or day services. It can be places where a great deal of violence and abuse can occur. And of course, in correctional facilities, a lot of women, it's a very high proportion of women with disabilities who are incarcerated, and they certainly experience violence and abuse there. There are particular forms of violence and abuse which are specific to women and girls with disabilities. And there are some risk factors for those. So women with disabilities experience violence over longer periods of time, in more settings, more perpetrators, and distinctive forms of violence that are related to their disabilities. And so they might be things like someone taking a woman's communication aid or mobility device, so that as a form of abuse, so that a woman has less agency and autonomy by those things being taken, as an example. And women with disabilities are less likely to report violence or to seek support for this violence than women without disabilities. And we know what reporting rates are like already. So there's an even greater fear for women with disabilities of not being believed, being listened to, or violence being downplayed or denied. I'm going to hand back to Swazik now, who's going to talk more about the intersecting drivers against of violence against women and girls with disabilities.
Thank you, Helen. So we mentioned a little bit earlier another framework, Change the Story. And Change the Story really focuses on the gender inequality drivers of violence. I think that most of us are familiar with those drivers in the Zoom room today. So I'm just going to remind you of what they are. Driver one is the condoning of violence against women. It is when we excuse or we downplay that the violence women are going to experience. Driver two is about men's control and decision-making and limits to women's independence in public and private life. So it could be the underrepresentation of women in politics, in management position and decision-making positions on the workplace, or also just at home, with a strong separation between what men and women should do at home. Driver three is rigid gender stereotyping and dominant forms of masculinity. I think we are all familiar with the strong gender stereotypes, men who are supposed to be strong, women who are supposed to be weak, for example. And the last gendered driver is male peer relations and cultures of masculinity that emphasize aggression, domination, and control. It could be, for example, the perception of women as a sexual conquest and objects that need to be controlled. But I would like to spend a little bit more time today to unpack what we call the ableist drivers of violence. So it's going to be drivers that impact people with disabilities. So driver one is the negative stereotypes about people with disabilities. For example, if we perceive people with disabilities as being a burden to society or as being incapable, it's going to decrease the value that society has for people with disabilities, and people with disabilities are going to become more legitimate targets for violence. An example for women with disabilities could be that quite often we believe that girls with disabilities don't need sex education or respectful relationships education at school. So they are not going to be provided with this kind of knowledge at school. And down the track is going to create some serious issues for them. Ableist driver two is accepting or normalizing violence, disrespect, and discrimination against people with disabilities. And when society does that, it's going to increase the rate of violence against people with disabilities. And the perpetrators of violence are going to be less held accountable for their violence. And a very common example for people with disabilities would be, for example, if they have a support worker that is abusive with them. Very often, if the support worker displays violence, we are going to attribute the violence to other factors. For example, we are going to say it is carer burnout or carer stress. Driver 3 is controlling people with disabilities decision making and limiting independence. So this one could be all the laws we have in Australia that limit decision making and independence of people with disabilities, such as substitute decision making policies. But it also happens in the public and private settings. Today, we know that women with disabilities are more likely to be ignored regarding issues that are going to affect their lives compared to men with disabilities, where they want to live, for example, where they want to work, and things like that. And the large able driver of violence is social segregation and exclusion of people with disabilities. It could be, for example, the education, employment, and living arrangement policies we have in Australia today, such as special schools, sheltered workshops, or group homes. It could also be, as Helen mentioned before, that today we have many women with psychosocial disabilities in prisons. And overall, that factor relates to all the barriers we have in society. But what is very key in changing the landscape is really that for women with disabilities, gender inequality and ableism are going to overlap for women with disabilities. Not only because they are women, but also because they have a disability. And one aspect I would like to unpack as part of this framework is that it is important to keep in mind that women with disabilities also have some additional identities that are going to discriminate against them. So it can be related to the race or the sexual identity. And I just would like to unpack one example. Maybe let's focus on racism and colonialism. We know that today for First Nations women, the rates of disability and violence are higher. However, today we still have few organizations that can provide culturally safe resources for First Nations women. If we think of migrant and refugee women, we know that if they are on a temporary visa, they are not going to be eligible for disability social aids, such as the NDIS. And if they experience violence, they might be afraid of reporting the violence because they might be afraid of losing the sponsorship they have. But even for migrant women who are permanent residents, today we still lack culturally appropriate services for migrant and refugee women. So those drivers of violence are really concerning, but the good news is that violence is always preventable. And I will hand over to Helen to talk about the action.
Thank you. Thank you, Swazik. Yes, so the question that we think about as we read through the drivers, and we see them on the slide, and we also, I guess, encounter them in our daily work, is what can we actually do to bring about change using a gender and disability lens, as we spoke about before? How can we actually implement the primary prevention principles that we know about and inform our work to bring about real change for women and girls with disabilities so that gender-based violence is prevented? So if we come back to this, there is a series of 6 essential actions around prevention. And so if we come to the first one, we're really thinking here about building support for gender and disability equality. So across the country, across the spheres in which we work. So thinking about structures, thinking about the prevention work that we do to make sure that it has a disability as well as a gender lens, and ensuring that the work that addresses ableism in the disability sector considers gender as part of that work. So there's a lot of thinking about disability and gender transformation. So the next section, thinking about improving the understanding of violence experienced by women and girls with disabilities, so that we can inform the action that we take. So legal protection from all forms of violence for women and girls with disabilities, challenging the normalisation of violence against women and girls with disabilities, as Swazik shared an example before about excusing and using responses about carer burnout to downplay or minimise or not challenge violence, challenging social support for attitudes that excuse, normalise violence, normalise discrimination, and normalise ableist behaviours. So focusing on perpetrator accountability as an action to challenge that, that behaviour. So the third action is thinking about stereotypes, challenging sexist and ableist stereotypes about women and girls with disabilities, challenging these within the community, within our organisations. So thinking about, offering respectful relationships, education for women and girls with disabilities, and requiring that education is, of course, accessible and responsive to needs. So improving representation of women and girls with disabilities in media and in popular culture in ways which are enhancing and positive. Promoting representations of women and girls with disabilities in workplaces that are positive, increasing women and girls' presence in workplaces, in leadership roles as well. If we come to the fourth action, that's really thinking about social inclusion of women and girls with disabilities. We can use policy and legal and social measures to ensure that inclusion happens. So challenging discrimination, amending laws that enable segregation or indefinite detention, incarceration of women and girls with disabilities, promoting inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in political, public and community life, and ensuring that equitable access exists to education for women and girls with disabilities, facilitating employment and participation in communities, safe, non-segregated living arrangements with an adequate standard of living, so income, so that women and girls with disabilities can actually make decisions about where they live, with whom they live, and the type of work that they do. If we come to the next action, action 5, again, promoting decision-making and autonomy for women with disabilities. So challenging social norms that limit women's independence, agency, limit their participation in leadership and decision-making. Specific initiatives that people might be able to implement that enable women and girls with disabilities to exercise their right to making decisions, and promoting rights for women and girls with disabilities to participate in positions of power. So in all issues that affect their lives, of course, is where we talk a lot about removing barriers and discrimination and giving people, a basic standard of living. It's harder sometimes to see the value of women and girls with disabilities in leadership and decision-making roles. That's an area that still needs to be challenged. The final area that we need to, or action, is about gender roles, stereotypes. So challenging those rigid attachments that we have to ideas about not only masculinity, but and ableism, but group cultures which promote rigid ideas of what it means to be a man, a woman, or a person with disabilities. And instead, we need to promote alternatives which are positive and reinforcing of who people really are and people's needs. I'm going to hand back to Swazik to talk about the principles around prevention of violence towards women and girls with disabilities when we're implementing the essential actions?
Thank you, Helen. So it's true that when we talk about the essential actions, we are really talking about what we need to address the drivers of violence against women with disabilities. But when we talk about the prevention principles, it's a little bit different. We talk about the how we can implement the essential actions. So you can see on this slide, we have 10 principles. I'm not going to unpack all of them. I'm going to choose 3 of them. And they really emphasize the values we want to have when we undertake prevention work alongside women with disabilities. So an important principle is center the input of women and girls with disabilities. Because it's true that if we want our prevention work to be meaningful for women with disabilities, we really need to properly understand and address violence against women with disabilities. And it means, for example, that we need to create safe and accessible opportunities for women with disabilities to share their lived experience and to really be recognized for their expertise. Another important principle is ensure the autonomy, community ownership, and control of women with disabilities and their organizations. Once again, it is really important to ensure that our people work is relevant and meaningful for women with disabilities. And it really means that we want to work with women with disabilities. We don't want to work for women with disabilities. And maybe another principle I would like to unpack is ensure accessibility and inclusion. So this one really refers to the fact that we really want to ensure that women with disabilities can be involved in the design, development, and implementation of prevention work on an equal basis as people without disabilities. So an example of how we can do that is whenever we work with participants, let's ask them about their accessibility requirements. And let's commit to make any reasonable adjustments that might be needed. Also, when we design programs, it's really important to provide for sufficient time and sufficient budget so we can properly address the accessibility requirements of women with disabilities. So I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Zoe because I think we are due for a break very soon.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Helen and Swazik. So much we can unpack together in our breakout rooms together. We're going to move to a break just for 2 or 3 minutes, if that's okay. And then what we're going to do is head off into breakout rooms. Please don't leave the session because we've got everything set up in the back end ready for us to move into those breakout rooms. So nobody's going to be put on the spot at all in those breakout rooms. It's just going to be a safe space for those who want to speak up. We're going to share a Google link with you to be able to type any thoughts that you might have into it. So just feel free to provide input if you want to speak up. So 2 or 3 minutes, if you could just put yourselves or keep yourselves on mute, and we'll come back at 10:27 and we'll head off into those breakout rooms. So go and grab a cuppa and we'll see you in 3 or 4 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
First, I'd just like to acknowledge lived experience of women with disabilities, including neurodiversity, mental health and chronic health conditions. And in addition, the important work undertaken by lived experience organisations, including WDV. And I'm so pleased to be here today with Andrea, Jackie, Jodie, Julianne and Sam, who are members of the Project Experts Group. And their lived experience and expertise is central to the Margins to the Mainstream project. This is a partnership project that's working with our primary prevention partnership in the Eastern Metro region, and also with WDV. So today we're going to focus on sharing some of the messages that are central to the campaign. And at the end, I'll touch on the resources that are available for anyone who wants to access them and use them. I'm hoping after the wonderful presentation from WDV, we'll see that taking action during the 16 days is a really practical thing that we can do. So first up, I'd like to hand over to Sam, who will give you a glimpse into the co-design processes and how lived experience has informed the messages and the resources. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. I'm now going to provide an overview of the co-design processes for the 16 Days campaign and the videos. I've greatly enjoyed being able to co-design the 16 Days campaign in the experts group. In 2021, we started with brainstorming what equality and inequality mean to us. I found this very difficult, as some of my most important experiences of inequality were also the most painful. It was difficult working out what to share and how to express it in a way that would educate others effectively. The small group work with other experts was really helpful in finding ways to express my ideas safely and effectively. Having the opportunity to brainstorm as a group and hear the ideas of other experts was a really critical part of the co-design process. There's a great deal of overlap between the issues that we felt were most important for equality for women with disabilities. It was really satisfying to have the help of the group to shape our ideas into 16 clear messages. We then moved on to providing guidance on the visual representations of our messages, with the illustrators being other women with disabilities. Our messages were well used and we made several presentations. We had fantastic feedback provided to us for all of our presentations. While we started filming the videos in 2021, they were put on hold due to lockdowns until 2022. The messages used in the 16 Days campaign in 2021 provided us with the basis for what we talk about in the videos. This was a different sort of co-design process. Each of us decided what the priority messages we individually wanted to talk about. We also decided which examples from our lived experience we felt comfortable sharing. This year, the experts group worked together to review and fine-tune the messages and illustrations for the 16 Days campaign. We increased the focus on several factors we felt were important to communicate. Firstly, the messages are a reflection on the human rights of women with disabilities as a group, rather than individual issues. Secondly, we've highlighted the negative impact of both gender and disability discrimination stereotypes on our opportunities to enjoy human rights. Finally, we focus on the importance of allies to working alongside women with disabilities to help protect our rights. We're now going to highlight some of our messages. I'll pass over to Jodie.
Thanks, Sam. We have developed a set of 16 messages that groups and organisations are able to select for use on social media for any day during the 16 days. We have also suggested social media tiles for 4 international days of significance that fall within the 16 days. This is the message that we have suggested be used tomorrow, the International Day for the Prevention of Violence Against Women. Equality is when discrimination and violence are prevented, as sexism and ableism should never be accepted, justified or excused. I hope that people who see the videos might understand more about discrimination and abuse that women with disabilities experience. We want to stop physical violence and other abuse and discrimination in which women with disabilities are treated differently to other women or men with disabilities. This discrimination and abuse can be perpetrated by families and friends, by professionals and service providers, and by strangers when we're out in the community. Some comments and behaviours women with disabilities experience may seem like small things. Bad use of language or a joke being ignored. Questioned about my disability casting in public by people I don't know. or being asked why I'm using the disabled toilet. But when there are multiples of these being experienced on a daily basis, they add up and are more difficult to cope with. That's why it may seem better as a woman with an invisible disability to keep it hidden. I didn't disclose my invisible disability while I was in the first years of university. However, trying to fit it in an able-bodied world became more difficult because my health condition was getting worse. Eventually, I had to disclose this. I was then asked, why are you studying human movement when you can't move? I changed to disability studies, but at the time, that did not lead to the supports I needed being put in place or fair treatment. As a woman with a disability, I often feel vulnerable. When I'm asked about my thoughts and feelings, I feel empowered and in control of my decisions of my life. That's why it's so important for people of all genders, ages and backgrounds to learn more about experiences of women with disabilities through this year's campaign. Educate yourself about ableism and don't let the small acts of discrimination slip by. Help to remove these microaggressions. Help women with disabilities break down the barriers we face, listen to us, get to know us and make sure we are heard. Think about how you and other people you know can be active bystanders. Take action when you see a woman with a disability being treated unfairly. Take action when you realise that the ways in which the community group you are a part of or the program, service or organisation you work for could take action to address the structural barriers that women with disabilities face. Thank you, and over to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Jodie. Trying to, I'm back on video now. Okay. Equality is really important to me. As one of our messages for the 16 Days campaign says, equality is equal and respectful relationships, irrespective of gender and disability. When women with disabilities are treated as equals, it is easier for us to participate in community activities, in social groups and in organisations. That feeling of equality stands out for me in the illustration that goes with this message. That's the message. Women with disabilities say equality is organisations valuing our lived expertise in co-design, consultation and advisory roles. The illustration shows a group of women sitting at a round table. They are busy talking to each other, meeting all together in a positive way. Everyone is feeling equal. Together, they can create something together. That illustration could be a group of women with disability engaged in co-design, or it could be women with disabilities in a consultation with the staff of an organisation, or women with disabilities employed as staff. Please create opportunities for women with disabilities to feel equal in the mainstream settings. For me to share ideas, learn and create together with other people, I need some assistance with accessibility. For my learning difficulties, for example, it is important to provide information, written and spoken, in advance of our meetings. Please don't use jargon. Give me time to ask questions. Arrange for a note-taker for me. Other women with disabilities have different accessibility requirements. Ask us. Our different lived experiences in the experts group have combined to develop the resources for this year's 16 Days campaign. Please share our messages and resources to help to make positive changes for women with disabilities and our communities. I'll hand over to Julianne.
Thanks, Jackie. Being part of the M2M experts group has opened up a whole new world for me. It's been an amazing 2 years. I've learnt so much from everyone in the group. The experts group and my support worker have been my support network and greatest allies. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about my support worker and at the same time give you some pointers about how you can be part of a support network, an ally and a defender of the human rights of women with disabilities. This is the message and illustration on the social media tile suggested for the 29th of November, the International Women's Human Rights Defenders Day. Equality is having allies who work alongside women with disabilities to take action against sexism and ableism. It's a day to celebrate and thank women who defend human rights and all people who defend the rights of women. I'd like to focus on what this message means for women with disabilities. As other M2M experts have shared, women with disabilities encounter discrimination on the basis of gender and disability on a daily basis. We have undertaken self-advocacy for ourselves constantly. The systemic advocacy work of organisations including WDV is so important. For the change to happen, we need allies and supporters, individuals and organisations to lend their support and take action against sexism and ableism. I really love this illustration. We can see that a woman with a disability is breaking down a barrier, perhaps one of those hard to see invisible barriers related to sexist and ableist assumptions and stereotypes. Next to her are two allies, a woman and a man who are holding up a banner with the writing, "We support your rights." One of them is also holding a hammer in hand and asking, "Do you need help?" The experts group was really clear that we want allies to be taking the lead from women with disabilities, not taking over. I'd like to share with you about what I appreciate in an important ally to me. My support worker encourages my dreams and celebrates my wins. She helps me progress to achieve my goals. She also gives me space to grow and grows with me. She steps back and lets me take the lead and has my back when I can't. She gives me confidence with what I can do and encourages me to try new things. She also challenges me or calls me out sometimes on my BS. She helps me think through other ways around what I can't do or haven't done before. Our conversation starter document for this message has tips for allies of women with disabilities in everyday life and in workplaces. So I hope you use it. I'll now hand over to Sam.
Thank you, Julianne. I'd like to share with you one of the messages included in the social media tiles for this year's campaign. This is the message and illustration on the social media tile we suggested to be used on December 3rd, the International Day for People with Disabilities. The message is, equality is asking us to dance, not just inviting us to the party. We are not limited by gender and disability stereotypes. The illustration shows 6 people dancing in ways that are right for them, underneath a disco ball with coloured musical notes floating above their heads. On the left, you can see 2 women joining in with the other people dancing. One of these women is a wheelchair user. Another woman uses a walker as a mobility aid. This is a happy image. While the message refers to dancing and parties, it also applies to all other aspects of our lives. Women with disabilities can experience exclusion and segregation in social, cultural, economic and political life due to the gender and disability stereotypes and assumptions made about us by other people. The experts group co-designed the short conversation starter document for this message. This document includes some tips for enhancing inclusion and challenging sexist and ableist stereotypes. For example, be positive about what I can do, rather than focus on my disability. Include our ideas when planning an event, social or work related. Let me decide how I participate. Ask women with disabilities about individual accessibility requirements and see us as individuals. To share a personal experience. I was at an event where the music was very loud. Someone turned the volume down when it was noticed the music was making me feel unwell. This meant that instead of sitting outside on my own, I was able to stay inside with everyone and enjoy the event. I'm now going to hand over to Andrea.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, my name is Andrea. I'm a woman with a disability. My computer's actually up, hang on. My issue today is my sight. I'm unable to read properly, so I'll be using my screen reader to guide me. Because of this, I ask you do not use the chat function, please, while I'm presenting, as I hear everything in the chat in my headphones. I also have worked in community development, which is why I focus on a message about uniting and taking action. The full message is, as women with disabilities, we say, equality is when everybody takes action to protect the human rights of people with disabilities, of women with disabilities. The image shows colourful creatures holding placards and our banner stating our overall action, call to action for the campaign, Unite and Take Action. You are welcome to use this message on any day of the 16 days of activism you would like, although we are recommending it for the final day of the campaign, 10 December, which is International Human Rights Day. There are many ways you can unite and take action. Some ways are mentioned in the presentation by Helen and Swazik from WDV. Some by other experts who have spoken before me. I'm going to summarize and reinforce some of them, so you can keep them in mind and unite and take action during and after the campaign and when the campaign is finished. Some of the main ways to prevent violence against women with disabilities are education, education, education. Educate your family, your friends, your colleagues. Lead by example and model respectful behaviour. This is particularly important around children. They learn by observing how people close to them treat each other. Be an ally. We notice women with disability treated with disrespect, discriminated against, or witness sexist or ableist slurs, call them out. You might think, I am only one person. How can I make a difference? Well, when lots of individuals do the above things I mentioned, and others mentioned by Helen and Swazik and the rest of the Midas and mainstream team, then things will start to change. Even tackling the issue independently is a start. When lots of individuals spread the message about preventing violence against women with disability to their friends, and they encourage their friends to pass on to their friends, well, you get the picture, don't you? So let's unite and take action to prevent violence against women with disabilities. I will now hand over to Vega to tell you about our resources.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So just I hope now you're feeling inspired about the messages and you've had a chance to look at some of the illustrations. So just to say, these are a sample of some of the social media tiles that are available for you to download and use, whichever ones that you like or are appropriate for your organisation. So we have also some postcards, 2 postcard designs, which on the reverse have some simple suggestions about how you can take action. They'll be up on the website by tomorrow. So apart from social media and obviously encouraging your comms people to post or posting yourself, I'd just like to say other organisations use the messages and illustrations in e-newsletters or during events, both internal events for staff or with stakeholders, clients and community members you work with. For example, disability advisory committees or other committees and advisory structures that many organisations have. So please don't just think that social media is the only way you can use these resources. We'd love you to be creative and use them however you can. As mentioned, there are 6 short videos that are going to be available with links via a website tomorrow. And the videos feature the 5 experts who have spoken to you today. The longest goes for 20 minutes and has information structured around the 16 key messages to prevent violence against women with disabilities. And the other videos range in length from around 3 to 4 minutes. This is a poster that's also going to be there on the website. Oh, sorry, Danny, I'm jumping backwards and forwards. So this shows you the 16 messages and illustrations that are on the social media tile, but this is also a nice thing to use in discussions or to put up in a reception area or an office over the photocopier, for example, where people can engage with it. We also have another poster that can be used for events. And you've seen the postcards. We have 2 email signatures too. So really just letting you know that the social media tiles are there and available at that link below. And by tomorrow, you'll be able to access the other resources, which include the conversation starter documents that some of the experts have referred to, which focus on those 4 international days, have short quotes from the experts and some tips about what you could do to be an ally for women with disabilities in your personal life or in your organisation in the workplace. So we'd love to know how you use them. Please do send back information either through Women's Health in the Southeast, or I'll put my email in the chat. We'd love to know after the 16 days what you found provoked the most conversation and engagement, and any suggestions you have for further resources would be wonderful. Thank you so much for the time to talk to you.